Hi, my name is Scarlett and I run a small business called AFRAYED Upcycling. I take secondhand textiles and turn them into beautiful size inclusive clothing and accessories. Today we are doing a sew along for my third pattern that I've just recently released, and it is the kitty apron dress. This one is a little different. It only includes the front and back bodice pattern pieces because I want you guys to upcycle. I am going to show you how to make this scarf version of the dress and showing you what kind of techniques I use to stitch the scarves together, the different kinds of trimmings to use. But I will be making one in just one fabric. That way, if you do just want to go for one fabric for all of it, including the ties, then I will give you all the measurements and things like that. So I created this pattern because I wanted a statement piece that I can just throw on top of outfits just to snazz them up a little bit. It features a round neckline, it has a few ties at the side, and then the bottom half has been upcycled using scarves to create this nice sheer flowy thing, so I can layer it over trousers, skirts or dresses. It really is a versatile piece that I think everyone should have in their wardrobes. Let's start with going through the fitting of the pattern and how to adjust it for your bust. After printing the pattern, check the bust measurement on the pattern to see what size is going to be best for you. If you don't want too much of a gap at the side of your dress, choose the pattern size closest to your bust, then extend the sides. Make sure to evenly do this for the front and back bodice. If you have a smaller bust and you do not want to include this dart line, then what you do is make up the dart as if you're sewing it, and then grab some scissors and you're going to cut in a straight line up until the point of the dart. And I'll show you what this does. So right up to the point like that. And as you can see, you've got a flat piece of paper there. Then with this, you grab a piece of paper just to fill in this dart. So once you've stuck it down, we're going to draw in the new line here. Because we've opened this, your side seam will probably sit more straight like this. So I recommend cutting this off, putting this against your body, and then cut where you need to here. If you do decide to make any adjustments to the front bodice piece, make sure all the measurements are the same for the back bodice piece. There are shorten and lengthen lines here, so once you put it up to your body and realise maybe it's too small or too long, you just cut along this length here. And then if you need to lengthen it, measure how long you want to extend it and then stick on top, and then just join the lines where you need to. And same with shortening, you just overlap. Say you want to make it a bit shorter by 1 centimeter, overlap it and then just join the lines to create a nice smooth pattern. And the last thing before starting, we're going to need to know the skirt measurements for your dress. So to do this, grab your front bodice pattern piece. So measure along this line, so that's about, let's say 26 centimeters. And then because this is half the front bodice, we're going to times that by 2, which is 52 centimeters. And then because we want a nice even gather for the entire front and back, we are going to times that 2 again, which is 104 centimeters. From your waist, measure how long you want your longest piece of material to be. So for me, it was 60 centimeters. You will need to add 1.5 centimeters because that will be your seam allowance for the top of the skirt part of the dress. And then depending if you are using just one fabric, then I would add an extra 3 centimeters for a hem. But if you're using scarves and you're going to use the very ends of the scarf, so you don't need to hem anything, then you will not need to add any measurements to it. But I think just to be safe, I am going to add 3.5 centimeters overall. So when it comes to cutting out the skirt part of the dress, I will need a rectangular piece of 104 centimeters wide by 63.5 centimeters long. And I will need 2 of these rectangles, as the other half will go on the back of the dress. Okay, let's do the fun part and start selecting fabrics. I've already decided on the tea towel I'm going to use for this apron dress, and it's this snazzy little Dalmatian one. I bought this massive bag of scarves and sheer fabric from eBay for like £10. Honestly, there's about over 100 scarves in here that I use for my apron dresses. And I'm gonna go and choose maybe 3 or 4 scarves, and depending on how much fabric you want to add, or if you're just using one fabric, then I recommend maybe 3 to 4 scarves for this project. I've gone for some really like party ring colours. So we've got this lovely long scarf here. We've got this purple blue scarf, which I think will look really nice. And then I've added some of this black printed scarf here. This thick scarf here, which has got this really cool texture on it. And I found some actual Dalmatian printed material. Well, it's a scarf, it's a huge scarf. So I only use a very small bit of it, but yeah. So yeah, this is the fun part. Just go through your cupboards and that and find some materials. And it doesn't have to be scarves, it can just be sheer material or any material. As long as you've got enough to make a gathered waist for the front and back, then that's all you need. So here's my trimming box. You're going to need 8 lengths of trimming and about 60 centimeters per length. And you can decide if you want to go for just one kind. I have lots of different kinds, so I'm just going to choose a few. And again, get creative. You can use lace, or you can even make your own ties. There's so many different options. So I'm going to select my trimmings now. One for like bits of lace. I'm going to put the thicker bits of lace at the bottom of this pattern, and then these bits for the top. Before starting, make sure that you've transferred all notches and markings from your pattern pieces onto your fabric. Pin and stitch the darts of the front bodice and front bodice lining. If you have thicker or stiff fabric, cut these darts open and press. Alternatively, press these darts upwards towards the underarm. With right sides together, sew the front bodice lining to the front bodice along the curved neckline. Repeat this for the back bodice and back bodice lining. Once you have sewn these, carefully cut notches into the seam allowance around the neckline. This will help the seam sit flat. Then press the seam allowance towards the neck lining. We are going to do something called understitching. Understitching is a line of stitches that are sewn close to the edge of a facing or lining to keep it from rolling toward the outside. To do this, we are going to stitch about 2 millimeters away from the edge of the seam on the lining side. Make sure to catch the seam allowance underneath, like shown here. Open the front bodice and lining at the neckline so it lays flat, just like I've done here. With right sides together, place the back bodice on top and pin the shoulder seams in place. The front and back lining should be right sides together, and the front and back pieces should be right sides together, as shown here. sew and press these seams open. To attach the lining to the armholes of the bodice, we are going to try this technique, which is often referred to as the burrito method. So what we do is we take one side of the main material and then tuck the lining just underneath like this. And then we take the other side and tightly roll it towards the middle of the bodice like this. This roll will need to be sandwiched in between the main and lining fabric as shown here. Then by starting at the shoulder seam, pin around the armhole and then sew, making sure not to catch any of the rolled fabric. Carefully cut notches into the seam allowance around the armhole. Pull one side of the bodice through the other, right sides out. You now have one armhole lined. Yay! So to do the other side, you just need to repeat the same rolling method, which I will show you here. Carefully cut notches and then pull the bodice through to have both armholes lined, and then press these armhole seams. To help press these curves, you can use a corner shaper or you can press roll like I am doing here. It is totally optional to understitch the underarm. If you would like a more professional finish, then to do this we will need to start at the side seam of the underarm and then understitch about 2mm away from the edge of the seam on the lining side, finishing at the shoulder seam. You need to do this for each side, so start at the underarm, finish at the shoulder seam. Because of the small gap at the shoulder, this might be a little tricky. So make sure to keep checking that you are catching the seam allowance only, not any other bits of fabric. You want to lay the bodice like I have done here, so keeping the main fabric and the lining separate. Using the notches on the front bodice pattern, place 2 of your ribbon, lace or ties at the side seam. If you have thicker lace, I would recommend that you fold this in half and keep it at least 1.5 centimeters away from the hem of the bodice. Then with right sides facing, fold the lining on top so the side seam is aligned. Pin and sew. Trim the corner close to the stitching, then turn the piece right sides out. Then press this seam and use a corner shaper if you have one to make sure that the corner is nice and crisp. Repeat this step for each side seam. Now let's work on the skirt part of this dress. Using the measurements that you have calculated before, begin assembling the skirt part of your dress. If you are using scarves or sheer material, there are a couple of ways you can attach these. If you want a nice neat finish, then I recommend a French hem. However, as this is a upcycling, fun, experimental project, I recommend just stitching the scarves on top of each other. As this is an apron dress, the sides will not be joined together. Therefore, if you want a neat finish, then I recommend hemming the sides, or alternatively just do a line of stitching to stop the fabric from fraying. And again, this is all about fun and experimentation, so why not try out different lengths or maybe adding some ruffles or textured fabrics to make it really stand out. I'm going to be overlaying a scarf on top of my skirt part just to give it a bit more volume. If you are using just one fabric, then please hem the sides before moving on to the next step. Once you have your 2 skirt pattern pieces, use a long loose stitch to create a row of stitches that we are going to gather. I recommend sewing about 1 centimeter away from the edge. Make sure you leave a couple of inches of loose thread to allow easy gathering. Slowly pull the thread ends and start to evenly distribute the gathers along the edge. Start to pin the gathered edge to the bottom of the bodice piece only, keeping the lining separate. Make sure that the sides of the skirt do not pass the side seam of the bodice. Please use this as a reference. Baste the gathering in place 1 centimeter from the edge. From the right side, just double check that you haven't missed any of the fabric whilst gathering. If you need to, trim any of the excess sheer material from the bodice. Okay, so we are now going to add the lining to the bodice. To do this, we are going to be turning the front bodice piece and lining wrong sides out whilst placing the rest of the skirt and the ties in the middle, which is going to form a kind of bag. Pin and stitch a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, leaving a 10 centimeter gap towards the middle. Once you have done this, we are going to turn the garment right sides out by pulling the fabric through that 10 centimeter gap that you had left before. Now repeat the steps for the back bodice. Before moving on, just give your garment a quick check to make sure there's no base stitches or gathering stitches left on the main part of the garment. Delicately use an unpicker for this. To close the turning gap between the lining and front bodice, use an invisible or ladder stitch like here. Hopefully this ladder stitch diagram will help. You need to go up through the crease of the seam like this, and then come down and then need to go through the front bodice seam. This takes a little bit of time, and occasionally you need to check that you are not going through the actual front bodice. After hand stitching, give your dress one final press and ta-da! You have finished the coolest garment ever. pattern can also be used to make a top. I quickly whipped up this top and it's made from Sanderson fabric. If you did want to make a top, you will need a front and back bodice in main fabric and lining. And for the ties, I did 6 centimeters by 50 centimeters. And then to actually make the ties, I just folded over the fabric and then stitched along one of the longer lengths and one of the shorter lengths. And another reminder, before stitching the bottom part of the top or dress onto the bodice, you will need to hem the 3 sides as shown here. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I would absolutely love to see what you make with it. Please tag me on Instagram or TikTok or send me an email. And if you would like to buy this pattern, you can find it on my website at afrayedupcycling.co.uk. Thank you.